Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Disaster Recovery and Build Back Better. Today we are going to talk about culture, climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. When we see about the relationship between disasters and climate change, much of the scientific literature often doesn't relate that these two are interrelated, because disasters, they're often triggered with an event, but whereas the climate change, it has a long run mechanism into it, and it has the impact is more from a long run instances. Like when you see about the recent phenomenon, the recent concerns, they are relating that the climate change is directly and indirectly related to the disaster risk. So let's see how the discussion is going on. When we say about from the CRED report, 2015 report, this is what the map you get. The EMDAT has recorded about 240 climate related disasters per year before 2000, when compared to the 341 per year, so that there's a 44% of increase. And if you look at it, when we see the number of natural disasters here, mostly in the Chinese, you can see that China, India, Mexico, the later on you can find part of Russian and the African continents, and also the northern part of the Canadian aspect. So you can see that these are the number of disasters and how they are very much prone. If you look at the classification of these disasters, it is just the geophysical disaster which we are talking about, the earthquake or the tsunami, or these are most of the landslides which are more related to the geophysical aspects of it, and they are very less. But whereas here it is going almost, these are climatically, whether it is a hydrological or meteorological aspect. So this is where the climate induced. So there have been various studies which actually address that climate induced disaster is on higher end, and there is a need that we need to integrate that climate change and the disaster risk, and how we have to work in hand to work with it. And that is where, like many of the international conventions, frameworks held by United Nations, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, have recognized that there is a relationship between disaster risk and climate change in a rational manner. Similarly, the conceptual approach of the SREX report, where SREX, which talks about putting the disaster risk in the center and how the settlements are exposed and the vulnerability component, and also the long run weather and climatic events put these settlements into vulnerable conditions and how they are exposed. And on one side we have these greenhouse gas emissions, which are on the continuous concerns, and which is actually causing the anthropogenic climate change and also the natural variability, so which is subjected to the disaster risk. And this is where the disaster and the development, and this is where they are interrelated, from Frederick Cunney, when he talks about the disasters and development are interrelated with each other. And that is where the development, within which the disaster risk management and the climate change adaptation, how they can actually contribute it to the disaster risk. This is what the whole understanding. And the main important point here is linking the CCA, climate change adaptation, and the disaster risk reduction is one of the important crucial steps to achieve the sustainable development. So this is one of the important indication that we need to integrate these two components. Disaster risk reduction and how it has been conceptualized when we have the concept and practice of reducing disaster risks through a systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters. The first stage, which talks about the risk assessment, where the scientific knowledge also contributes in analyzing the risk, and also the local knowledge also contributes in understanding the risk. Whereas a dialogue, when we talk about the communication part of it, where the inside actors, outside actors, actually they interface with each other. So that is where the NGOs, the governments, the scientific community, the policymakers, and also the victims, the beneficiaries, who are the inside actors, the communities and the marginalized groups. And then coming to the action, which is again, there should be an interface between the top-down initiatives and the bottom-up initiatives, and how these actually, holistically, they contribute to the DRR, so disaster risk reduction. So there have been a jargon in these terminologies of disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management. So Begum categorizes this into two main components. One is the DRM, disaster risk management, and within which the disaster risk reduction is one of the component, and the disaster management is another component, where DRR is a concept and practice of reducing disaster risks through a systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters. Whereas the disaster management follows 4 different phases. It talks about mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So it goes, the DRM goes beyond the DRR by adding a management perspective which involves prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and with response. So this is how it has been understood by different experts. For instance, in India, when we talk about climate change adaptation, there are National Action Plan on Climate Change, which is from the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change. They talk about the government of India have established different national missions. Like for instance, these 8 national missions, which talks about the solar mission, enhanced energy efficiency, sustainable habitat, water mission, national mission on sustaining Himalayan ecosystems, national mission on green India, sustainable agriculture, and strategic knowledge for climate change. So these are different missions which were established by the government of India, and in order to address the sustainable development goals and as well as the climate change and the green aspects of it. And in fact, the Hugo framework for action, which talks about for the ongoing climate change negotiations, have also led to the growing consensus among the policymakers, politicians, and practice that there is a great need to integrate DRR and CCA. Not only by conceptually, but in terms of practice, both regional level, subnational level, national and international level. And UNISDR also recommends the functional linking of DRR and CCA within the context of poverty reduction, because we are ignoring that poverty aspect, because there is a bottom level situations, how we can actually communicate to them, how we can increase, how we can address these poverty groups who are the marginalized groups who are often affected by the disasters and who have a bigger impact on these climate change impacts. We mentioned about these 8 missions, but the important thing we have to do is every mission have their own objectives, every mission has their own action plans, every mission has set up to deliver certain things. But unfortunately, they're all talking about habitat and eco-sensitive habitats, and how they are interrelating, how these different missions are interrelated to each other. How they are coordinating with each other, how they are cooperating with each other. This is one thing which we have to understand, that there is a very little focus on disaster risk reduction, because each mission is focused on the green emissions, on climate change, but how they are able to see the disaster risk reduction as one of the integral component within it. So this particular aspect has not been laid so far. And before getting into any further discussion, I think we need to understand what are the major differences and challenges for integrating DRR and CCA. So one is, you have John Berkman and many other authors have listed out these are the fundamental differences and similarities, how they have these challenges in bringing them together. One is the scales, because the two talk about different scales. The CCA talks about the more longer and temporal and larger spatial scales, whereas the disaster, it talks more on the shorter and smaller scales. It triggers by the event, and it talks about the both positive and negative effects, and whereas here the disaster is mostly focused on the negative impacts. The research preferences, it is mostly on the top-down approach, but these are the preferences which mostly on the bottom-up approach. Whereas the common challenges, which has a multi-stakeholder participation and multi-scale coordination. So, for instance, scale mismatches. And if you look at any particular settlement, like this is the Banda Lake before tsunami and after tsunami, and it is being focused in that particular spatial level where it has an impact with the disaster, whether it is a tsunami or an earthquake. But when you look at the weather impacts, like this is from the Swedish Meteorological Agency, and where we can see the snow cover has started gradually reduce from year after year. So earlier it was 8 months snow cover, now it is 6 months, now it is gradually reducing. So they have both positive and negative impacts. For instance, the farmers say, yes, the snow cover is less, so we may get an extra crop. But there are also other impacts. The temperature is increasing on it, and it has impacts on the health and as well as the communities, the way they live. So, and similarly, the climate change, like what you can see is the coral reefs, which has a negative and positive impacts and no effect on the global level. So one data is talking about a global level impacts on the coral reefs, and the other data talks about the snow cover impacts, and the other data talks about very limited to a spatial scale, maybe the affected area. So this is where the DRR and climate change have the data itself talks in two different scales. Like for instance, I want to bring you that when we talk about culture, how this culture is related to climate change and disaster risk reduction. So I would like to bring one of the important contribution of Regina Mapaw Lim, where she talks about the Philippines' cultural identity of traditional settlements in development. And she uses a framework of cultural environment for analyzing these indigenous traditional settlements and their cultural identity and their understanding towards the impacts of the climate change, and as well as the day-to-day routine vulnerable situations. Like if you see the Philippines, you have the mountainous culture on the top, and you have the mainstream culture, the Tagalog mainstream culture, and you have the sea culture, which is the Coron Islands. So about 7,000 islands that comprise the Philippines. There are over 120 ethno-linguistic groups that continue to inhabit traditional settlements spread out over the archipelago. So these vernacular settlements are located in different terrains within ecosystems, creating economies or ways of living particular to culture, place and people. So they have their own language, they have their own dialect, they have their own culture, they have their food habits, they have their learned dressing senses, they have learned communal understanding. So what she did was she developed a kind of conceptual framework of analysis. So she actually looked at what kind of structures that create the cultural identity and the concepts of development, and she worked in this cultural environment framework of how the mainstream cultures, the alpine cultures and the coastal cultures, how they respond, what kind of systems they do have, and that is what she derived some very participatory approaches. Like for instance, in some of these rice harvesting cultures, where there's mountain people, like they have these rice harvesting as one of the important livelihood source. And here even the pig is also one of the important food which they consume, and you can see that they also conduct a lot of feast with these pigs and also pig jaws, and they put the rice bundles, and which are actually a symbolic representation of the ritual feasting. So in fact, there are different hierarchies within the community, and that is where the tradition of the ritual feasting by wealthy members of the community, which is a practice, reinforces the egalitarian qualities needed by Sadanga society to maintain the rice production culture, because the butchering of so many animals for a family wedding is a way of redistributing the accumulated wealth to the poor. It is a family's privilege to work diligently, accumulating animals to be butchered for the community to share. And one cannot accumulate wealth and not share it, for the task of rice production requires the sharing of labor and community cooperation in order to bring in the harvest. So here, even the traditional feast, it is talking about how it actually one is sharing his wealth, and that is how brings the labor and the community's cooperation, so that they have to come together for the harvest. Now, they also use the Sadanga language used to conduct these rituals and to negotiate a number of peace pacts which define the territorial boundaries and rights related to the neighbors. So these feasts also brings the neighbors together. They also discuss various talks, and they also talks about the water rights. Understandably have been the cause of tribal wars, because it is a resource essential to the cultivation of rice. Without an entire settlement could be starved. So they also discuss about these water rights, how to share the water, because when agriculture has become the main occupation, one has to look at water resourcing, and distribution is an important task among the communities. So even these traditional patterns also formulate certain negotiations within the distribution of natural resources, sharing of the accumulated wealth, and bringing the community together. Like, I'll show you a small video of Regina Paulim's work. You can watch it. So you can see that even the kind of granaries, how they store, and how the whole ritual process has been organized within the community and again across communities. Also talks about the common shared systems and how they share the land. The elders plays an important role. And here it becomes, the rice culture with all the rituals, beliefs, the inheritance patterns, and all these associations with the land and territory continue to be part of their identity, providing means in their lives. So each and every system, how the community lived, they're all becoming a kind of structures that have created an identity for this community and how they can sustain. Whereas similarly in the Coron Island, which is actually the fishermen settlements, and how they can adopt the indigenous knowledge in understanding the fishing techniques and as well as understanding the nature and the ecosystems. Like Regina have actually mapped even how the fishermen they understand the sacred places, which are more important for the breeding purposes, and where the community have defined the boundaries, where they have defined the boundaries showing different lakes, beaches and the sacred places. This is a kind of survey which we have done, how the communities have understood this. And there is also certain indigenous myths, how they have also transferred some knowledge to the next generations, that for example the Panyan or the sacred area is a home to the giant octopus. Like one of the interviewers say that my father taught me to avoid these places, it is a forbidden place, and none of the indigenous Tagbanga would go to these sacred places because they mutually respect and recognize it. When one goes to these places, the giant octopus holds onto the boat and sinks it till it drowns. So when in sacred places, one must remain quiet and sometimes ask permission for being there. Like in case of sacred places, Panyan, where there is a Manilabiot, a large octopus with 7 or 3 large tentacles. So normally they have a myths which has been transferred from their forefathers and grandfathers, where they say that you don't go to this place. So they really respect that as a communal understanding, and that is how they say that there is a large octopus which might hold your boat and pull it down. So in fact, when they ever happen to go to these places, the elders speak, do not mind this person, he is from here, do not harm him. If a prayer is not intoned by the elders, a sickness will occur. So this is all kind of intangible traditions where certain understanding of the lake and the fish breeding and the nature of fish and how they have to respect these particular fishing grounds. So this all has to a part of the intangible traditions which pass from one generation to the another generation. A small film of Regina's work will be again shown here.
Talagang na namin sa aming mga ninuno, yun ang kanilang hanap buhay, dagat, pangingisda. Kaya hanggang sa ngayon, yun na rin ang aming nakasanayan na hanap buhay. Pwede rin kami hanap buhay sa iba, pero hindi na namin masyadong kasi talaga yung alam namin dagat lang.
Ang patakaran ng katutubo, yung pamamaraan sa panghuli ng isda, kung paano maging hindi maubos halimbawa yung mga similya. Ginagawa po na namin yan dito sa Coron Island, katulad ng pagkukuha namin ng mga lamang gubat, mga pagkain sa gubat, o kaya mga gamit sa gubat. Yung tinuturo na kagad namin sa mga bahay. Para pag sila na lang halimbawa dito sa aming pulo, alam na nila yung mga patakaran.
Ngunit dayag lang. Walang makina.
Kailan po nag-umpisa dito na nagkaroon ng yung bangka na maliliit? Kasi noon balsa lang.
Ngayon na lang.
Tatawag ka ng matanda.
Oo, ipanalangin ng matanda. Pinapasalamatan sa Panginoon na binigyan ako ng bawl. Binigyan ako ng makina na sakyan ko para ikabubuhay sa aking pamilya. Para mapanganak buhayan ko ng habagat.
Pasasalamat.
Pasasalamat.
Saka para hindi ka kuno ng mga pugitang malalaki. Para wag tumaob yung bangka mo.
Oo, para wag tumawa. Palaging swerte.
Palaging swerte.
Palaging swerte.
Yung panghuli noon ng matatanda, bato sa pugita. Yung pugitang bato. Yun ang panghuli ng matatanda.
Ito, pagkatapos na linisan na ganyan, kabitan ng pabigat, kabitan ng tingga, pagkatapos yung tingga, kawil, saka itong palikpik niya, swivel, kompleto ito. Mayroon pa yung tali dito, mga taling kunting nylon, maliliit. Kailangan yung swivel, hindi rin siya sobrang mahigpit. Pag mahigpit ito, hindi siya ikot. Mahina yung ikot niya. Kailangan yung swivel maluwag na kunti. Pag hindi maluwag, dito mahina rin ang ikot niya.
Tungkol sa pagpintura naman.
Sa pagpipintura naman, walang problema. Basta napinturahan. Kailangan din sa pintura yung kulay din ng kursunada ng pugita. Kasi pag hindi kursunada ng pugita yung kulay, kahit mag-apong kang hila-hila dyan sa laot, hindi abulin yan.
Mag-alis ka dito sa bahay. Pag sinigawan ka, ayan daw malas. Anong bungan niya? Nabulong patingan.
Pumagsay, linaw-linawan mo. Punta niya magrutos, baliw-baliwan mo. Imo pagkawuton, tunga niyang distilwan, tungkak na yang laut, kanya bagbagan mo. Kung ako mapatay, hindi mo tangitan. Kaya magluluway ng pinanguliyo. Tawag tutulong yang lagi talawid kay lukang kalaguwa, hindi makalawan. Ako magsay, hindi mo tangitan. Kaya magluluway yang pinanguliyo. Kung yawag kong away, ang segundong yun, ito magmuray nun, niling kong titig mo. Handa mo niling, di ko maparisan. Katulad ng buwan, nagkaliwanagan. Pinanaw-tanaw ko, yaong karagatan ng aking napika, sungit na nga.
Pagpakdo nga mo ilang ka.
Nanay ni tatay, galit na sa akin.
10.
Nahandang ako, bulok na matalim.
Pagkatapos pa natin dito.
Kung ako'y patayin,
Patay.
huwag mo lang
tatap ng mata.
Magtingin sa akin.
Dalawa yung surot, pwede na.
Tuloy-tuloy. Pag natanim na, anong susunod na gagawin?
Linisan.
Araw-araw.
Araw-araw.
Tapos, pagka-3 buwan,
Bilat na sa araw.
bilat na. Gano'ng katagal binibilat?
Kung mainit, mga 4 na araw. Ito yun. Ngayon talagang matagal. Kasi talagang
Ari, anin. Wala. Ayun lang. Ganyan lang. Wala, bakit tuwalo mo pa? Tira. Ari, anin. Yung tinagpano yung nakata. Ari, anin.
But here, in the present conditions, one has to understand that many migrated fishermen have understood that there are a lot of fish available here, and they started migrating to these places, and they adopted different various advanced fishing techniques, and they are not necessarily environmental friendly, but they might have used the dynamite, the fine nets that catch even a very small fish, fry, and the pounding of the coral reefs to drive fish into the nets, all created problems of overfishing and the destruction of the environment when the fish live where the fish live and multiply. So these advanced techniques, these newcomers into these islands, they started using the fine nets, so that each and every net have a different proportion on what kind of fish it catches, and it can hold. But now they are not leaving any more fish, so that is actually bringing a lot of environmental concerns, especially with these migrant fishermen. And because when they are come to a different place, they are not tied to this place. They are not, their attachments are never tied to a particular place. With the fish gone, they move on to another island. That's what. So these Tagbana myths were no relevance to the fearless migrant, and so in fact, with these migrated fishermen coming into the picture, even these Tagbanwa learned new fishing techniques that did not go against their beliefs. That is how it has an impact of one don't understand the cultural aspects and how different cultures understand their ecosystems and the environment. With this, what you can see that how the coral reefs have been damaged, and because of using the dynamites and poisoned by sodium cyanide, which used for bringing in live fish. So now one can witness how it has an impact on the coral reefs. One certain coral reef has been damaged, then obviously it affects the marine system. Once the marine system is affected, when the aquasystem is affected, it also affects the human systems. So there is a chain process. In fact, the impact of tourism on burst nets production, the diminishing fish catch caused by illegal fishing techniques, and the careless attitudes of the people who do not have a long-term interest in protecting the land and sea, which provide a livelihood of Tagbanwa people. So these are some of the interesting facts that how local cultures understand the ecosystem and the environment, how these myths also protect the environment, but when the foreign intrusions comes, how they get impacted and one don't understand the other culture's interest and knowledge. There's spatial scale challenges. When we talk about the climate change, it talks about much bigger scales, larger scales, whereas the disaster, it talks about much more to the pointed affected areas. So it's very difficult to bring them together. For instance, when we talk about a flood impact in somewhere in Bihar, it may not necessarily that the cause is from the same place. It might have been the root cause might be in some other country, which is in China. Like for instance, if China builds a hydropower dam on Brahmaputra in Tibet, it may have impact in the Indian continent. So the cause is falling under a different political interest and domain. So it is a challenges in addressing that as well. So there is also a mismatch between the horizontal scales and vertical scales, where the sources of climate change often lie in other regions and countries than where its effects are shown. So, and also there is a scientific knowledge which has been generated from a very vast spatial scales of study and analysis is often not reflected for appropriate considerations at local level. This is the gap one can understand. Also the temporal and functional challenges. When we talk about the temporal and functional challenges, it is also about the role of different agencies, whether it is an NGO or a government sector or quasi-governments, whoever are coming. So especially the NGOs who are coming, the agencies to do the disaster recovery projects, they are here on a contract. They are here to do certain targeted work, whether it is a livelihood dimension, whether it is a shelter dimension. They finish that and they move on. Their visas are also expire and they move on. So long run, what happens? Who will take care of it? So they don't have long run commitments of how this place will get modified further, how people get adjusted to it. Like there is no proper evaluation. The ministries only evaluate how many houses they have provided, but not on how they have been accommodated, how people have responded to it, what are the temporal changes it occurred, how to make it into a mainstream development procedures. So for instance, in Latur and Gujarat, we can see even some of the houses still are empty, unoccupied, where we have also the knowledge mismatches in the norms. When we talk about the climate change, when it was discussed in the 80s, which was the first era, from 80s to 2000s, it was mostly focused on the greenhouse gas emissions, where the most of the scientific community are involved. It is the environmental problem. Whereas in the second era, from 2000s, this has been seen by the international agenda and also the social dimension come into the picture, where the social scientists and the development workers have increased their cooperation in the second era. In the third era, it also looks from the, this has been felt by other countries and other regions. So this has become a question of global justice in the near future. That is where the legal dimension came in the third era, and this is where we need to talk about develop of certain legislative, cultural and behavior norms which determine the functioning of human society and how the interactions between nature and society were created. So many of these legislative norms were often violated in the context of informal and coastal settlements. For example, the Coastal Regulation Zone, which was formed in 1991 and revised 19 times until the tsunami has struck, but then they were barely implemented. Also the knowledge mismatches. When we talk about different scales, different data sets, different climate and risk scientist practitioners, which they don't bring the transparent communication and collaboration and joint programming between various levels of actors, institutions and agencies. So there is all this actually leads to us an important question of how to use this macro level knowledge sets, data sets to inform the micro level data sets, and who should take this into consideration, in what way. A clear roadmap is needed for a better integration of CCA and DRR. So to summarize the whole aspect, we see that differences and challenges. We have disaster risk reduction on the climate change adaptation. It is because it is aimed at the adaptation strategy, which there is a scale mismatches, because it is aimed at disaster event with the long term implications. A drought is not just only a matter of 1 month, it may come from years together. Whereas the spatial scales, respective regions and localities prone to occur, where there is a global scale, sometimes there is a continental and intercontinental impacts. Temporal and functional challenges, because this is more to do with the short and medium term and mostly to the event related, and this has more of a prevention and also the long term adaptation strategies. Here the differences in function of agencies, players involved, and what is the scope of work, roles and funding, because at the end of the day funding is the most important part. Mismatches regarding the norms, when we have the legislative norms, urban planning norms, coastal regulations, how they do not relate to each other. That is one aspect. Knowledge mismatches, when we say the different in types and scales of knowledge, data sets and work applied. So for this, Lee and Wang, they actually come up with more explicit frameworks. They call about 6W framework. So they talk about why adaptation is needed for natural disaster risk. What is adaptation to disaster risk? And adapt to what? Who has to adapt? Who should adapt? How to adapt? What are the possible principles or criteria to assess the effectiveness of adaptation? So there is a brief summary of this whole 6W framework has been listed out. And now one of the important understanding from a built environment perspective, what we can see is there is a scale mismatches, the spatial levels data. So it is always, if you look at the built environment, we as a planners or architects, we only look at the plots, buildings and elements. We completely ignore the underlying topography and the natural systems, ecosystems and the public linkage systems. So they all are interrelated to each other. So one has to see the different sets of data, how they can come together and how we can macro level information can be inform the micro level information. It is where in my current ongoing study I developed this framework where we have the spatial dimension and it has also the vulnerability impacting on these, and there is also the adaptation process both pre-disaster, in disaster, post-disaster and the future risk, which has a short term and medium term of single and multiple disasters, and this has a long term adaptation through social learning. And here we can see that how the nature and culture can come together, and it also talks about how the adaptive built environments open up choices, connect past and future, and how it can reintegrate the humans and nature, for which cooperation, coordination between various agencies, political, technological, ecological, educational, and as well as the participation and communication across various segments, the global actors and the national. So all these things has to come. This is a very holistic framework which we worked on. And when we talk about an integrated multidimensional framework, so it investigates on three aspects. One is how different rebuilding practices have offered choices to a variety of users and users, how the natural environment with its ecosystems and services has been integrated in the placemaking process in different disaster recovery process. At the same time, how different rebuilding processes have addressed the challenges to connect both past and future needs and aspirations of the beneficiaries. So there are a few references listed out, so one can actually go through that. Thank you.